Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report on the Real News Network. As you know, on our show, we try to hold one of the most powerful political institutions in the country accountable, policing. And in doing so, try to make up for some of the biased and unbalanced coverage about this institution, an institution that holds too much power and often goes unscrutinized. Today, I'm going to pose a question that may sound pointed, but needs to be answered. Are police in this country paid to kill us? It may sound harsh, but consider the case of Mesa, Arizona police officer Philip Brailsford. He's the officer in this now infamous video that shows the death of Texas resident Daniel Shaver. And I just want to warn our viewers, this is very violent content, so please be advised. Shaver was staying at a hotel when police responded to a 911 call that a man was wielding a rifle. He had, in fact, been showing two friends a pellet gun he used for work for pest control. But despite the fact he was unarmed, this scene unfolded outside the hotel room where he begged for his life.
Okay, young man, listen to my instructions and do not make a mistake. You are to keep your legs crossed. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
You are to put both of your hands palm down, straight out in front of you. Push yourself up to a kneeling position. I said keep your legs crossed!
I'm sorry.
I didn't say this in conversation. Put your hair! Hands up in the air! You do that again, we're shooting you. Do you understand?
Please do not shoot me.
Then listen to my instructions.
I'm trying to just do what you...
Don't talk! Listen! Hands straight up in the air. Do not put your hands down for any reason. You think you're going to fall, you better fall on your face. Your hands go back in the small of your back or down. We are going to shoot you. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me!
Yes, sir.
Don't talk!
The brutal killing led to charges against Officer Brailsford. He was subsequently fired and charged with second-degree murder. A jury acquitted him in 2018, but that's not where the story ends. Because it turns out Brailsford made a secret deal with Mesa City officials. He was actually rehired so he could receive a lifetime pension in 2018, a secretive deal that is just now coming to light. That's right, the man who pulled the trigger in this horrifying killing will now receive $30,000 every year for the rest of his life. The same officer that had "You're effed" engraved on his gun. So joining us today is investigative reporter and Real News producer Stephen Janis. So Stephen, although this may seem like a minor payment, this actually has really far-reaching consequences, doesn't it?
Yeah, you have to consider the fact that the officer is just 28 years old, Brailsford. And so he will be collecting this $30,000 maybe for 60 years, let's say, given basic life expectancies, 50 or 60 years. That's a massive amount of money. That's like 1.5, 1.8 million. Now, to be able to purchase an annuity, for example, that would give you that kind of income over the period of life where how long he's expected to live, would basically you need about $600,000. I did the calculations. So basically, the city of Mesa, Arizona just minted a millionaire almost, made someone pretty wealthy, because at the age of 28 to have a $30,000 income for life is incredibly expensive.
Yes.
If he was 65 or 70, it would be a different story. But he's not. He's a young man, and these consequences are continual. He will, for decades to come, be on the payroll of Mesa City, and for an act that many people said was despicable. So it's a really perverse incentive, and I think extremely problematic and extremely expensive.
Right, and we can't forget that he was accused of a heinous crime.
Right.
I think people have to understand there is a huge pot of money set aside so police can retire early or simply leave the force for medical reasons, and how this changes the dynamics of policing. That's because in cases like Brailsford, retirement or extra pay is often used as a way to coax officers who get in trouble to retire early or leave entirely. Take, for example, New York City. The average pension for a retired police officer is $74,500 compared to $35,000 for a civilian employee. What that means is that pensions and other payouts are literally making cops like Brailsford millionaires, and in some cases, multimillionaires. Stephen, how are cops becoming millionaires after they stop working?
Well, I mean, the reason you have to consider it in this mode is that because people are retiring at such an early age and the money is given to them at ages that would be considered unprecedented for retirement. I mean, anyone who knows the big battle over Social Security in this country has been over raising the retirement age, because the sooner or younger you retire, the greater the liability. When policing, there's been no such problem. For example, in Baltimore City, it used to be 20 years and you could retire for life. 20 years. So people could retire at the age of 42 or 43. If you're healthy, there's another 40 years of life that the city has to cover. And so it creates a huge and overwhelming liability for cities, hundreds of millions of dollars that have to be invested to pay for these obligations. And they're not obligations a city can easily shake. It's written in the law. And courts are very, very, very reluctant to intervene in pensions. So when you hire a police officer, you're saying, I'm going to make you a millionaire, okay? And you know, I'm not just going to pay you good pay, and like in Baltimore City, we have overtime to work the streets, but I'm going to make you a millionaire. And you know, so there's some strange incentives in policing.
And as our next interview will point out, that's not where the perks end or the only perverse incentive that informs how we're policed. Luke Broadwater from the Baltimore Sun did a piece years ago about a policy in Baltimore that actually gives officers who shot someone bonuses, ostensibly for psychological trauma. In some cases, the payouts were made after they killed someone. Let's listen to what Luke has to say.
I was doing research into workers' compensation claims, starting at first with teachers and other aspects of city government. And one thing I kept noticing was after a Baltimore police officer shot somebody and killed them, many times they would apply for workers' compensation benefits. And that struck me as surprising. And generally what it was, and I'm sure it is traumatic to shoot somebody, I'm not trying to deny that, but generally what the reporting showed was that many times after shooting and killing somebody, a Baltimore police officer would apply for PTSD benefits, and the average pay they received as a result of their own pain and suffering from doing this was about $30,000 from what I could tell. So I did some reporting on that. It happened, I think, at least a dozen times in my research. You know, and obviously when families of the deceased heard about this, that not only is their loved one dead, but the officer who shot their loved one now is receiving extra money in their point of view. You know, that was very that was very hurtful to people, very hurtful to people.
So what Luke points out is that these aren't regular workers' compensation claims. They're supposed to compensate for time lost or inability to do a job, like where you have a hand injury and you need your hand to do a job. These payments are on top of that. So it's, you know, some people would argue it's like a bonus, although it is ostensibly, as you said, for post-traumatic stress disorder. It is not to pay for like psychiatric care or time lost for psychiatric care, but rather just extra payment that goes in your paycheck. And this is not limited to those kinds of claims. I mean, it's
and
all over.
And are the officers actually still being paid?
Yes.
Do they need this?
Yes, they're still being paid.
Okay.
They're still being paid. And what makes this even more, I think, difficult to understand, especially in a city like Baltimore, is meanwhile victims of police brutality are having to fight tooth and nail to be compensated. Victims of police brutality, as civil rights attorney A. Dwight Pettit, who is also a Real News board member, points out, are being stonewalled by the city, who are paying law firms millions of dollars not to pay out their claims. Let's hear what Dwight had to say about this.
He's come out and made the statement in terms of the officers who were convicted in terms of the gun trace task force, that he's not going to pay on the basis that they were out of the scope of their employment before he even dealt with the facts of all the people that have been injured, maimed, jailed, lost careers, lost livelihoods. He just came out and blanketly said he's not going to compensate.
So while victims of police brutality go uncompensated, cops are given bonuses for shooting us. It's a perverse incentive that often goes unreported and unexamined, but it is troubling to consider. How can we know a shooting is justified if these type of incentives exist? If an officer like Brailsford is given millions of dollars to retire, why wouldn't that enter the thinking of a cop who's contemplating pulling the trigger? Now, Stephen, let me push back against you just a
Okay,
little
sure.
bit, because sometimes use of force is justified. Like, for example, at a methadone clinic just this week, one of the patients shot at a nurse, a client, and a police officer, and he killed one of them.
Yeah.
And it took police officers pulling their guns to be able to bring him down. So
Right.
don't sometimes we actually need force?
I think that's a legitimate idea, but the problem is that we've made these sort of standards for pulling the trigger so lax, that an officer just has to have a reasonable sense that, they're in danger or their life is in danger to pull the trigger. Let's remember that taking a life is an irrevocable act. You can't take it back. Extrajudicial killings, or as Dwight Pettit would say, under the color of law, are things that can't be, no amount of money can bring a victim back. Really, we should have incredibly high standards for pulling trigger. But I think in this country, we have erred on the other side, where, if you look at Brailsford, he was acquitted by a jury. We have erred on the side of if an officer has any bit of fear, pulling the trigger is justified.
And aren't they trained to do so?
Pretty much. Pretty much it's like the idea is reasonable.
Right.
If an officer makes a reasonable, and that's a pretty broad, subjective kind of standard.
Right.
I think that for someone like me as a reporter who has interviewed many people who have lost loved ones in police-involved shootings or police killings, the pain never goes away.
Absolutely.
Because it is irrevocable. So, for us to say, well, it was reasonable, or there are cases that do require it, doesn't mean that every other case should be justified or rationalized in that context. It means that we have to look at it and say, is there anything else that could be done in that instead of pulling the trigger and killing somebody?
Right, especially when you think of a case like Stefan Clark, who was shot in his own grandmother's backyard for holding a cell phone, which a cop reasonably assumed might be a gun.
Yeah.
So it is that type of fear that police officers are dealing with, that at any moment someone could be holding a gun. That is, I think, part of the reason why we're seeing these police-involved shootings.
I think if you look at other countries, they look at us like we're crazy.
Yeah.
Because we just have pretty much given police a blank check to kill people. And I think given, the consequences of it, there should be a much higher standard.
And when you say a blank check, you make a really good point, because when you look around Baltimore and you see crumbling schools without heat and recreation centers in disrepair, keep this number in mind. Since the beginning of the decade, the city has poured over $700 million into police and fire pensions. And on top of that, recent estimates put the city's liability for post-retirement health benefits around $2 billion. It's a staggering price tag for an agency that has, by all measurements, been ineffective in Baltimore. And it's a huge bill for a city that is one of the poorest in the country and continues to suffer from record high crime.
I think you make a really good point that, this staggering amount of money has really not produced results. This year alone, at the 6-month mark, we have a 17% increase in homicides and a 25% increase in non-fatal shootings. Now, of course, one could say police are not the solution, but because the city has to commit so much money to these things like pensions, post-retirement benefits, we spend about $50 million a year on a variety of employees, school employees, city employees, but mostly police, with those type of claims that we're talking about, the kind of workers' comp claims. So the investment, the entire civic largesse of the city goes into that. And as we pointed out before, it's very important to remember these lopsided structures of inequality create lopsided structures of imagination. You have an empty, denuded recreation center as a symbol of the city's despair, and we can't fix it, or the crumbling roads, because we have to put $700 million into pension for police and fire. It doesn't make any sense for the poorest jurisdiction. What we get is higher and higher crime.
The bottom line is, do these incentives prompt police to create mayhem instead of solving problems? If you get a big payout for executing this incredibly violent act of shooting someone, what's the incentive to de-escalate? Who's getting paid to communicate and take a real interest in the community? What are the incentives there? Has an officer ever received an early retirement bonus for caring about the community and policing with compassion? Do police officers ever get money and awards for preventing crime instead of making arrests and making their stats? These are all vexing questions we will continue to explore on our show. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for your work on this and for investigating this.
Yeah, we'll keep on it. Thank you.
And if anyone has a case of police brutality or overreach that they would like us to look into, please contact me on Facebook or Twitter at Tea's Baltimore, or you can contact Stephen at Investigative V, or reach out to The Real News directly. I want to thank you so much for joining me for the Police Accountability Report on the Real News Network. Take care.